This is a video suggested by You Don't Need to See His Identification, great username by the way, and really piqued my interest, so I decided to knock up a list of some good Mac exclusives. The Mac not only had some decent exclusive games, but spawned a few industry giants, the most famous of which, at least I can think of, being Prince of Persia, which started out on the Apple II before being ported to absolutely everything. I have some fond memories of the classic Mac, as my mate's dad over the road had one back in the 80s and we'd play the odd game on it. The design always fascinated me, and this was before I'd even touched an IBM PC. All the music in this video is from Mac exclusive ShadowWraith, which, spoiler alert, makes an appearance later on. The Mac always seems to get overlooked when it comes to reminiscing about 80s and 90s computer gaming, so let's buck that trend and look at 20 Apple Mac exclusives. Before becoming famous for developing Halo, Bungie released games almost exclusively for the Mac. In fact, before they were acquired by Microsoft and it became an Xbox exclusive, Halo would have been released on Mac and Windows. One of their most famous franchises prior to this was another sci-fi first-person shooter series, Marathon. The first two games weren't technically Mac exclusives. The first two were also released for the Apple Pippin, although one could argue that the Pippin is essentially a cut-down version of a Mac, and the second also had a Windows version, but the third game, Marathon Infinity, was Mac only. Released in 1996, Marathon Infinity was a first-person shooter with a sci-fi storyline set several hundred years in the future. You play as a security officer attempting to prevent an alien incursion aboard the titular Marathon, a colony ship. In contrast to most first-person shooters of the time, the Marathon series focused more on the complex story than simply relying on fast-paced action. Gameplay is similar to the previous two installments but has a few tweaks. Graphically it's pretty solid for a game of that era, and the movement is really smooth. There's a rather large heads-up display at the bottom of the screen indicating the player's health, equipped weapon, etc., and unusually for the time also had a radar. Levels usually require the player to complete a set task before heading to an extraction point, but some actions result in the story path branching out, although the story always flows back to the same place eventually, so there aren't multiple endings. Some levels take place in a vacuum, requiring the player to complete them within a set time before the limited oxygen supply is depleted. Its multiplayer deathmatch was very highly regarded too, allowing up to 8 networked players to battle it out. In total, the single-player story mode has 25 levels split into 4 sections, each having its own intro screen, and there are an impressive 23 multiplayer maps. The Marathon series is a worthy entry in the list of great 90s first-person shooters, so if you're a fan of the early PC shooters like Doom and Quake, you should give this a try. Okay, so I'm already cheating a bit here with Dark Castle, as it wasn't a Mac exclusive, but it was at first, being released on the Mac in 1986 and wasn't first ported until the following year, and the 94 remake Colour Dark Castle was a Mac exclusive. The original was developed by Silicon Beach Software and the Colour remake designed and published by Delta Tau. A platform game, Dark Castle sees the protagonist Duncan explore the evil Black Knight's castle on a mission to dethrone him. The castle has 14 levels split into 4 sections: Trouble, Fireball, Shield and Black Knight. 2 of these, as their names suggest, allow Duncan to gain the use of a shield and the ability to throw fireballs, which will aid him in defeating the Black Knight. Duncan can run, jump, duck and throw rocks, so it's pretty standard platform affair, although this was 1986, so it's actually pretty impressive. The levels are a mixture of platforming and puzzle elements. Most remind me of the old BBC Micro platform games like Palace of Magic or Citadel, but there are levels reminiscent of the arcade platformers like Donkey Kong in there too. Movement's controlled using the WASD keys, with the mouse controlling the aim and throwing of rocks and fireballs. A game-changing setup for the time, and it's even thought by some that Dark Castle was the first instance of the WASD keys being used. There are 3 difficulty levels, making it more accessible for beginners. 94's Colour Dark Castle was pretty much the same as the original, but has a few minor tweaks, including new rooms, a 4th novice difficulty and a save feature. All in all, Dark Castle is a fun little platform game with simplistic but challenging gameplay. Crystal Crazy is a weird little action game published in '93 by Cassidy and Green. You pilot a spaceship which is amusingly piloted by a cow. See what I did there? The aim is to complete a set task in each level before escaping through the exit at the bottom of the screen. Tasks include revealing a picture, breaking objects, or defeating all the on-screen enemies. Movement is controlled by the mouse, with mouse clicks firing the ship's projectile weapon. Power-ups can be collected which give the ship shields or upgrade the projectiles. The player has a limited supply of bombs which can destroy all enemies on screen, and score bonuses are scattered throughout each screen. As the game progresses, the enemy movement speed increases and hazards are more numerous. Crystal Crazy is a very odd take on traditional space shooters like Asteroids, but an interesting one. Ares was a space strategy game developed by Nathan Lamont. It was originally published in '96 by Changeling Software, but they marketed it very poorly, so sales were underwhelming. After they went under, it was picked up by Ambrosia Software and re-released as shareware in '99. The story follows the journey of the ship, Ares, which was originally named Apollo and was the first human ship capable of interstellar travel. When Earth is overrun by an alien cult, the crew of the Ares must use newfound alien technology to take them on and free Earth. There are 6 main races featured in the plot, including humans and several other races that play smaller roles, but the human race is one of the most technologically primitive. The game features 21 levels in which the player controls Ares, as well as being able to simultaneously command the fleet's other ships. A feature that separated the game from its contemporaries was the ability to transition from an overview of the entire map to a close-up battle view, which is done by zooming in and out and is seamlessly smooth. Multiplayer included 5 game modes requiring various levels of skill in piloting or strategy. In addition to the multiplayer mode adding some replay value, the '99 re-release also added a level editor. Ares has some challenging strategic elements to keep you interested, combined with some simple but smooth graphics and fast-paced action. Definitely one for space shooter or strategy fans to check out, and it's been freeware since 2008, so it's easy enough to find. Mars Rising is a vertical shooter designed by David Waring and published by Ambrosia Software in 1998. Any long-time watchers of the channel will know that I'm a big fan of vertical shooters, and Mars Rising was perfect for those wanting to bring that arcade feel home to their Mac. It plays similarly to arcade shooters like Raiden. You pilot a ship as the screen scrolls vertically and shoot incoming enemies and collect power-ups, pretty standard. The graphics and pace are excellent, so Mars Rising looks superb visually. If I had one gripe, it would be that I was somewhat underwhelmed with the music, although the sound effects are decent, and to be honest that's mostly what you'll hear anyway as there's so much going on. The game can be played with 1 or 2 players and does have a story, albeit largely irrelevant for the genre. You're fighting Martians basically. Unlike the one-hit deaths of many vertical shooters, you have a shield meter which depletes as you get hit, which can be replenished by collecting shield power-ups. A great example of the genre here, and one that many might not have played considering it's a Mac exclusive. It wouldn't be a list of Mac exclusives if I didn't include at least one old school point and click adventure. Enchanted Scepters, released in 1984 by Silicon Beach Software, was the first Mac game to feature digitised sound. Although it's billed as a point and click, it's kind of a cross between that and a text adventure game. If you're not an old fogey like me, you may not remember those, but they were essentially adventure games where you move from screen to screen and interacted with objects and people by typing in text commands. Unlike these, in Enchanted Scepters you can click on items or pictures in the rooms in order to interact with them, but it still has the text-based command interface. The story sees you embark on a quest to find 4 elemental scepters hidden throughout the kingdom: Earth, Wind, Fire, and the lesser known 4th band member, Water. Probably not worth tracking down unless you're a huge fan of the early text adventures that were numerous on computers like the BBC Micro. Power Pete was developed by Pangea Software and published by Interplay in '95. It's a top-down run-and-gun shooter starring fictional popular action figure Power Pete. This creates an interesting premise for the story, as when the toy shop closes for the night, the toys all come to life a la Toy Story. Some toy bunnies escape and get lost around the shop, so Pete sets off to round them up. Problem is, the other toys aren't too keen on Pete, as he's the top selling toy, so they feel he's hurting their sales, so they do everything they can to stop him. The setting opens up a lot of options for the levels and enemies. There are 5 toy departments, each having 3 levels. Prehistoric Plaza with dinosaurs and cavemen, Candy Cane Lane based around sweets, Fairy Tale Trail featuring toys from children's fairy tale books, Magic Funhouse which nightmarishly seems to focus mostly on clowns, and finally Bargain Bin, which has all sorts of toys, with its main feature being a Scale X trick track which meanders through the levels. Pete's a big-chinned action man-like figure and has some quotes that appear both as speech bubbles and as voice samples, such as "Fire in the hole." Some of the levels remind me of Micro Machines in that you're playing down at that miniaturised scale, so household objects and toys seem lifelike. This is particularly true of the last level, Bargain Bin, because it has a pool table and, as I said, a racetrack with toy cars. Pete has to catch a set number of bunnies before the next level is unlocked. He has 4 hearts of health as standard, meaning he can take 4 hits, but he can collect Jawbreakers to increase this. Collecting 200 Jawbreakers in an area awards the player with 1 extra heart, up to a maximum of 8. Pete's standard weapon is a gun that fires suction cup arrows, but he can pick up numerous other weapons like guns and projectiles along the way, under the guise of accessories that were available for the Power Pete toy line, which again is a nice touch, I think. Power Pete received critical acclaim in 1995 and was even included with Mac OS 7 on new Macintosh Performer computers. In 2001, Pangea regained the rights and re-released the game as shareware with a new name, Mighty Mike. Pararena was developed by John Calhoun and released as shareware in 1990, but an upgraded version 2 was developed and published by Castle & Green in 92. Imagine a naff version of Speedball on hoverboards in a giant satellite dish and you have Pararena. The aim is simple: throw the ball into your opponent's goal while defending your own. The game is entirely controlled using the mouse, so the action can be pretty fast. The arena in which you play, aka the giant satellite dish, is located in space, and the 2 teams are Earth and some alien planet called Taygete, although God knows how that's pronounced. Prime Target is a wicked little Mac exclusive first person shooter developed by Wizardworks using the Marathon 2 engine and published by Macsoft in '96. The plot involves the murder of a senator, also your friend, and it's your job to take on the armed mercenaries who killed her and uncover the truth about the conspiracy surrounding her death. The action is smooth and well presented, and full video cutscenes are present. Prime Target has all the ingredients to make a good 90s FPS, with its level layouts, weapons, sound effects, and of course plenty of blood. The only thing lacking is a decent soundtrack. It also built on the already accomplished Marathon 2 engine, adding features such as breakable glass, bullet holes, blood spatter, and movable objects. The list of early to mid-90s first-person shooters on home computers is a long one, but being a Mac-only game, Prime Target doesn't get mentioned perhaps as often as it should. FERAZEL'S Wand is a 2D action platformer released in 1999 by Ambrosia Software. You play as FERAZEL, a skilled magic user who lives in a series of underground tunnels. Gameplay focuses heavily on lateral thinking, with an emphasis on avoiding the many traps and hazards, and levels contain hidden areas and items. FERAZEL'S home has been overrun by swarms of evil goblins and their sinister master, so he must use everything at his disposal to stop them. Available weapons include a dagger and his magic wand, which can be used to cast all sorts of magical spells once collected. The display at the bottom of the screen shows information like your equipable and usable items, health, and a magical power meter. Magic power is needed to cast spells and can be replenished by collecting magical crystals. Coins can also be collected and spent with vendors encountered throughout the levels. The levels have multiple exits which take you to different routes, but although this sounds good, later levels require you to hold certain hidden items in order to progress, so if you've omitted to pick those up you're basically fucked and have to start again, which is a massive design flaw. Other than that, it's a gorgeous game with some great sound effects and a top-notch soundtrack which just suits the atmosphere of the game perfectly. This entry is a 2-for-1 as ShadowWraith and its sequel Souls in the System were both Mac exclusives. Both top-down shooters developed by Terminal Sunset and published by Starplay, ShadowWraith was released in '95 with its sequel coming the following year. In the story you're playing as the digital mind of Alex Kendall, who has been assassinated but uploaded his consciousness to the net. I'm not sure how all this results in you piloting a little ship, but the levels are presumably a representation of cyberspace. There are 20 levels in total containing various enemies and several different weapons can be collected. Where ShadowWraith really stands out is with its superb soundtrack, which is like a cross between Amiga chip music and early 90s dance featuring techno, trance, hardcore and sometimes even Prodigy-esque beats. And as I said earlier, it's the background music to this video. Pathways into Darkness is another first-person shooter from Bungie, released in '93. I'd say it's more of a hybrid between an FPS, an adventure game and a dungeon crawler than a true first-person shooter. The engine was designed by Bungie after they'd seen Wolfenstein 3D running and were very impressed with it, so wanted to create something similar that would run on Macs. It started as a sequel to Bungie's earlier game Minotaur: The Labyrinths of Crete, but was reworked to have its own story in which you're a special forces operative sent to a pyramid in Mexico in an effort to stop a godlike being from taking over the world. Although in the interests of convenience I'm only showing you the gameplay window here, there are actually 4 on-screen windows in total, with the other 3 showing things like health, inventory, weapons and messages. Various monsters inhabit the pyramid's maze of corridors, some of which are pretty weird looking. The graphics have an almost cel-shaded cartoony feel to them, in contrast to the pixelated look of its contemporaries like Wolfenstein 3D. It's true that there are better examples of these games from this era, but it's an interesting part of history for a developer that's so well regarded today. Pathways into Darkness was pretty successful and received critical acclaim, which allowed the then 2-man Bungie team to expand. Spacestation Pheta is a platform game created by TNT Software and released as shareware in 1988. It's definitely one of the most visually primitive games on the list, but the gameplay is deceptively fast paced. The aim is to guide your little man around a series of ladders and platforms, avoiding hazards in order to gain a key which will open up the next screen. As the name suggests, this takes place in space, so there's limited oxygen and therefore time in which to achieve this. There are various elements which add depth to the gameplay, like cannons, trampolines and even teleporters, so it's really a puzzle platformer. There are 100 screens to play and there's a level editor if you want to create your own. Troubled Souls is a puzzle game developed by Randy Reddig, published by Varcon Systems in '94. At first glance this is a Pipe Mania clone, or Pipe Dream if you're stateside, but the gameplay is different. The aim is to connect the pipe pieces together in order to create shapes without any openings. The design borders on the macabre, with eyeballs, skulls, severed hands and other miscellaneous body parts adorning the pipes. Overall, it's a simple premise which is presented very well and has some good, albeit repetitive music. Escape Velocity is a space trading and combat game created by Ambrosia Software and released as shareware in '96. From a top-down perspective, although I suppose in space top-down is relative, you pilot your ship across hundreds of star systems, achieving interstellar travel through the use of a hyperdrive. The plot involves civil war and interspecies politics, and as a result you'll encounter numerous factions and companies, including governments, mercenaries, rebels, mining companies, trading corporations and pirates. You can choose to work, trade or engage in combat, and can even be a pirate yourself if you're that way inclined, boarding and looting ships. So you're given quite a bit of freedom in how you want to play the game, and there are a lot of options. Missions can also be picked up and completed, and these, along with NPC encounters in space, will move the game's main story along. Escape Velocity was well received, even winning Mac Users Shareware Game of '96 award, and spawned 2 sequels, the first of which was also a Mac exclusive. Operation Desert Storm was Bungie's first commercial release and second game overall, released in 1991. It's a top-down tank shooter based on the Gulf War, which was taking place at the time. It has 20 levels and a huge Saddam Hussein head as the endgame boss. It's pretty primitive even for 91, but another interesting step in Bungie's history. A10 Attack is a 1995 combat flight sim from Parsoft Interactive. I used to love these flight simulations back in the 90s on DOS, and this looks like one I would have enjoyed. The game takes its name from the A10 Thunderbolt II fighter bomber, which was introduced to the US Air Force in 1977 and produced until 1984. Missions are based on a fictional invasion of West Germany. At any time you can enter a map mode, which is used not only as a map but as a mission planner of sorts, and when in this mode the plane will automatically switch to autopilot. The engine was impressive for the time, featuring an excellent physics model and improved texture mapping, and several graphical improvements allowing for high resolution graphics and even multiple monitors. The cockpit's controls certainly look the part, and I've read that they're a pretty faithful replication of the real A10's panels. The aircraft had bombs, missiles and machine guns, as you'd expect from a combat flight sim. The polygonal graphics look gorgeous, and I was a huge fan of that style in the early 90s. Hilarious now, but that was what passed for 3D graphics for us back then. Sensory Overload is a first-person shooter from Reality Bytes, released in 1994. Going by the developer's description, it seems that Sensory Overload got its name from the fact that the game features, quote, lifelike motion, vivid lighting effects, stereo sound effects, and unparalleled graphical realism. You play as a guy who's woken up with no memory of who he is or how he got there, but there are terrorists after you for some reason. One interesting feature was the ability to travel back and forth between levels, which was unusual for an FPS at the time. Ironically, the gameplay is far from a sensory overload, as there just aren't enough enemies on screen at any one time, and the ones that are pretty slow, so it doesn't create much of a thrill. NS Shaft was first released as shareware by Nagy P Software in '96. It's a very simple game. The aim is to make your way via platforms down a vertically scrolling shaft using only 2 buttons left and right. Various hazards need to be avoided, like spikes, but the player must also be careful not to descend the shaft too quickly, as going off the bottom of the screen results in death too. Some of the platforms flip, some have springs, and some act as conveyor belts. That's all there is to it really, but it can be a good bit of fun. It also has a sister game, NS Tower, which is the exact same game in reverse, so you're ascending a tower rather than descending a shaft. NS Shaft has since come to Windows, so it's no longer a Mac exclusive, and you can now get it for free on iOS. Curse of Dragor, or DRACOR, is a fantasy RPG dungeon crawler developed by Banshee Software and published by Domark in 1995. You make a team of 4 from 15 available characters, then assign them each one of 6 classes and set their attributes. These adventurers are seeking to free the land after it's cursed by the evil Prince DRACOR, the game's namesake. Gameplay wise, the combat is real time, with XP and levelling working as expected, with battles or puzzle solving awarding experience points, and as characters level they gain access to better gear and improved attributes. Although at face value it seems decent enough for this genre of game, this was released in '95, which is a fair way beyond the dungeon crawler's heyday, so Curse of Dragor didn't go down too well. So those were 20 games exclusive to the Mac. Are there any that I didn't mention that you particularly like? And of course, I'd love to hear your opinions on these 20 in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching.